This is John Gordon with State of Vermont Adult Protective Services, here with Joe Nussbaum, Assistant Director of Adult Protective Services.
Hi, everyone.
And today we're here to talk about mandatory reporter requirements and also the definitions and the processes that are used within Adult Protective Services State of Vermont. So for our purposes today, it's important to understand that the definitions that the State of Vermont operates under are in statute, and those can be found at http://legislature.vermont.gov/statute/section/33/069/0692.
And if you didn't catch all that, you can always just go to Google and Google Vermont APS statute or Vermont Title 33. Either of those will get you to a copy of our statute, and much of what you will see appearing on the slide today is language taken from our statute, and what we will be talking about will be sort of the interpretation and how to put this in practice as a mandatory reporter.
So as Joe said, the language that the definitions that we're going to be talking about today are definitions that are pulled from the Vermont statute. And so a lot of organizations have their own sort of internal definitions for vulnerable adults or what might be considered abuse or neglect or exploitation or forms of maltreatment. But for our purposes, these are statute definitions. So to start with, Vermont APS is here to investigate allegations of abuse, neglect, and exploitation against vulnerable adults. And so to begin with, we have a definition of vulnerable adult. Now this definition has several points to it which could apply in any particular situation. Some of their points have to do with the residential status of a vulnerable adult, or a person who would be considered a vulnerable adult based upon where they're residing and implicitly based upon the level of care that they need in order to reside there. There are also considerations for individuals that are not within a resident that provides a certain level of care. And so you could be a vulnerable adult and be in a resident, or if you're in a resident, it's presumed a certain type of residence required to be licensed under Chapter 71. Then you're presumed to be a vulnerable adult. But if you're just out in the community, you could also be a vulnerable adult. And for those individuals, we're looking at the type of care that they require, whether they are able to conduct their own activities of daily living or instramarital activities of daily living, or more specifically, whether certain aspects of their disability or infirmities of aging limit or impair their ability to protect themselves. So this could be someone who has a memory disorder but is otherwise able to do their own routine, take care of themselves and live independently, but maybe they're having memory limitations and they don't realize that maybe an acquaintance or family member is stealing from them or borrowing, quote unquote, borrowing from them. Because they don't remember that this thing has been happening repeatedly. That's just one example of how a disability or infirmity of aging could impair an individual's ability to protect themselves.
And I'll add, it's important to, if you haven't picked up already, there's a lot of ways that somebody can be deemed a vulnerable adult, and it's not necessary for you as a mandatory reporter to ascertain or be able to say definitively if this is a vulnerable adult. There's some specific things that will have to be there. For example, the very first thing, they have to be a legal adult. But the rest of the things, often fall into a diagnosis which may not have occurred yet. Again, the way to interpret this for today is to look at these are all the things that may apply, and you can call and report or do an online report or whatever way you file your reports. We'll get to that later, and we will pick it up from there and determine if it is indeed a vulnerable adult that we're looking at.
There are three types of maltreatment that that fall within our consideration. There's abuse, there's neglect, and there's exploitation. First, we'll talk a little bit about abuse. And when we talk about abuse, there are some aspects that the statute are sort of hidden, or maybe not hidden, but stated within the statute that are just really important to understand. One is that abuse there's intent. This is intentional behavior. So there are times when a person can do something towards somebody else, and it could be viewed as abusive. But when we look at abuse, we're talking about intentional behavior. This could be physical behavior. This could be verbal behavior. Most of the time we think about the physical act of somebody hitting somebody else, striking somebody else, or those sorts of things. But there's various aspects of abuse, most commonly the physical or verbal. But what we're really looking at here is intentional behavior. There are some other aspects. When we look at the unlawful confinement piece, this could be something where someone's being restrained, either tied to a bed. This could be where someone's being confined within a room or within a building without need or illegally. This also could be through the use of medications or drugs, where a person's administered a drug or medication for the purpose of controlling them in a way that's not medically necessary or that's illegal.
And just as we spoke about with determining vulnerability, the two things that we need in a report are A, what makes the person vulnerable or to the best of your knowledge, and B, what form of maltreatment, and we're starting to talk about abuse. And just as we said with vulnerability, you don't need to be able to determine for yourself or be able to prove that they're vulnerable. Likewise, you don't necessarily need to be able to speak to the statutory definition of abuse when you make your report. And you may not even know from what you're witnessing if it would fall under that. That's why we investigate these allegations. So, for example, there could be much more of a nuanced case going on where somebody is withholding privileges or making more implied threats that could very well fall under abuse, but we really need to investigate that. So again, what we're giving you here is, on the slide, is a lot of information from our statute and things that may come into play, but the key thing is for you to, if you suspect it, even if it's in your gut, go ahead and report it, and we will pick it up from there. If the allegation rises to our level of our statute, we'll investigate it to determine if that's in play.
The next portion of the next maltreatment that we're going to look at briefly is neglect. Now, with neglect, typically neglect is seen as behavior that's omission, an intentional or reckless omission. The other piece to that is that this is done by a caregiver. So if a person is not in a caregiver role, a person does not provide care for a vulnerable adult, then they, almost by definition, cannot be neglecting that an individual. So neglect only applies to caregivers. So this, when you were looking at neglect, this could be also extended into the areas of if a person is a mandatory reporter and they do not make a report of when they suspect abuse, neglect, or exploitation, that could be in and of itself a piece of neglect.
And one other aspect that I'll point out that's just very important here that the slide concludes with is sometimes we look at patterns. So if something is reported initially and there's not enough evidence to really fall under our statute for us to investigate, if we do see something happening again and again, and John just brought up the example of not reporting, for example, that in itself can be a form of neglect by a caregiver. So it is important, even if you've possibly made a report in the past that you know did not move forward into an investigation, to keep reporting it if it comes up again, because that in itself can rise to the level and allow us to move forward.
When we talk about caregivers, primarily we're talking about those individuals who are sort of accommodating vulnerable adults' inability to manage their own ADLs or IADLs. So these are people that presumably the vulnerable adult cannot conduct their own activities of daily living, and so without this person being there and providing the service, these activities of daily living and instrumental activities of daily living wouldn't be being completed. So that's it sort of broadly, but there's also individuals involved in care, medical care, and other types of care that would fall under a caregiver definition.
And a lot of time, caregivers may not be on your radar. If you go into our statute, there's a lot of examples, such as school bus drivers, for example. Most people don't think of those as being individuals that are responsible for caregiving, but especially given that that's usually a younger population. But you can have vulnerable adults that are still in the public education system, and a bus driver that is responsible for their care while they're on duty. So again, you know, lots of examples, lots of ways this can go, and the key is to call it in, and we'll kind of work out the particulars.
One of the aspects of neglect is that if the vulnerable adult has decisional capacity and is directing the caregiver to follow a course of action which could be considered neglect, if the vulnerable adult is giving instructions for that to take place that way, then it wouldn't be considered neglect. It'd be more of a type of a self-neglect situation. And so in the state of Vermont, there's a very strong self-determination tradition. And so APS in the state of Vermont doesn't investigate cases of self-neglect. And this could be sort of a simple self-neglect where a person is living independently and possibly not living to the same standard that someone else may think is necessary, but also falls under why, if they are giving their caregiver, no, I do not want this care to take place, that could be considered self-neglect, and that wouldn't meet the statute definition for neglect.
And we get how difficult these cases can be. You know, a lot of time the situations that we're looking at with self-neglect are not pretty. That's why they're elevating to a report. It can be an extreme hoarding situation, or even to the extent of putting somebody's life at risk because of behaviors that they're choosing. But as long as they do have that decisional capacity, and the way our state is set up in Vermont, it doesn't fall under our statute. So again, not a reason to not report. We always want to hear from people when they suspect that there's maltreatment going on, but this is just by way of explaining this. You know, a lot of states are different. Almost every state does include self-neglect. Vermont does not. So if you make a report and you see it screened out for that reason, that's why.
The last category of maltreatment is exploitation. Exploitation is the single most common type of maltreatment that we see. That's within the state of Vermont and also nationally. Exploitation is a growing problem as well. Not only the single largest category, it continues to grow as a poor proportion of the maltreatment that's occurring. So exploitation, this could be funds, this could be property, this could be getting somebody, leaning on someone, using their vulnerability against them to impel them or coerce them to provide some service or action. So exploitation, it takes many forms. And one of the tricky things with exploitation is that when you look at abuse, for instance, the behavior sort of stands alone on its own. If you look at neglect, then again, the behavior sort of stands on its own. But sometimes you'll have exploitation and you can have a person sort of, a vulnerable adult sort of agreeing to the behavior being exploited, but it's because of the coercion or because of the leverage that's being placed upon them. So exploitation can be tricky sometimes to suss out.
Just a couple things about exploitation and then maltreatment in general. As John said, exploitation, specifically financial exploitation, is the highest occurrence of maltreatment that we investigate. However, as I'm sure most people are aware, in Vermont, we're also looking at a very a growing problem of medical prescribed medicine diversion. So there's, you know, as part of the drug and chemical abuse that goes on in the state, there's a lot of prescription drugs that are being diverted for that purpose. So, you know, just again to emphasize that it should be on everybody's radar, especially for mandatory reporters. That's usually a world that people come up against and something to look out for. And a broader point that I wanted to make is that all of these forms of maltreatment, whether it's abuse, neglect, or exploitation, they can co-occur. There's a term that's sort of come up in more recent times. In the last year, I've heard it a lot more, of poly-victimization. And that is when somebody has more than one of these forms of maltreatment. And so it's just something to look out for. An example in this case is you may have some sort of sexual exploitation going on, which could very easily cross over into sexual abuse. So just to be mindful of that and to look, you know, when you see one of these things occurring, to maybe look if there's incidents of others. As our end goal is to investigate these and find evidence of anything going on, the more that you can report to us and the more details, the more ability we have to move forward and hopefully address cases that they need to, and if somebody needs to be substantiated, that heightens our ability to do that.
As Joe mentioned, there are many types of property that exploitation applies to. He mentioned the medication being a common aspect. Another very common aspect would be housing, especially you see there with people that move in and maybe may move in and then they don't move out, and so that could be an example of coercing someone to provide a service, and the service being housing. So that's a common type of exploitation that can be seen. And also gaining access to a person's funds or gaining access to a person's bank account, maybe through fraud or coercion or other means, is also a common type of exploitation that's seen.
And again, you don't have to have definitive evidence to make your report. If you, I see that vehicles appears on this list. If you see somebody that you recognize as a caregiver and has been struggling financially, and all of a sudden they show up to work and they're driving a sports car and don't have any other explanation. I mean, that, you know, it may have nothing to do and there may be no exploitation going on, but it may be enough for you to look into that, and then we can follow up and work with banks and work with the players that we need to determine as best we can if there is some type of exploitation going on.
When we talk about where can this happen and who does this, as with a lot of maltreatment, not just the vulnerable adults, this crosses geographic boundaries, it crosses socioeconomic boundaries. The one commonality with most victimization, and victimization of vulnerable adults is no exception, it's most often those who are isolated. This could be isolated socially, geographically or otherwise, which sort of makes sense. Those that are alone, if someone's coming along to victimize them, if they're isolated, then there's less of other people to raise the alarm. It's kind of like the predators on the savannas of Africa. They chase the herd and then they pick off the ones that lag behind. It's a similar thing, just applied to a different context. Now, one common thing that we see is that a lot of individuals think about, a lot of people think about this as occurring in a professional environment. And while maltreatment does occur in a professional environment, the vast majority of maltreatment is occurring in the community. It's occurring between people who know each other, so acquaintance or family members and those types of relationships.
And we put these numbers up there to just make you aware, more than anything, that we're aware at APS that this is at play. I think there's a knee-jerk reaction often to blame a caregiver because they're the ones that have this intimate access, and there's less likelihood or less desire, for obvious reasons, to blame a family member or an acquaintance. And where I guess the point being is we're aware of that in APS. We know that it's the small minority of cases where a caregiver or professional is the, I should say professional over caregiver because that could be a family member, but somebody in a professional capacity is much less likely to endanger their career and profession by carrying out exploitation. So again, just a nudge to not be hesitant to report these things and know that APS is going in with their eyes open.
So when we talk about mandatory reporters, there's a lot of overlap between mandatory reporters and caregivers, which we talked about earlier. Generally, people involved in caregiving are mandatory reporters. Joe mentioned the school bus drivers. That's one that oftentimes people don't think about in the context of vulnerable adults. But remember that adult is classified as someone over the years of 18 years and older, and we can have individuals in schools up to the age of I believe it's 22. So there can be some overlap there as well. But by and large, it's individuals engaged in direct care.
And I think it's fair to say, too, that there's a dimension of this that isn't so clearly defined even within Department of Disability, Aging, and Independent Living, where APS is housed. We have members of our own department and divisions that we're not entirely clear if they fall under mandatory reporters because there's some gray area of where they may or may not fall under the definition of caregivers. So the point of bringing that up is just to urge everybody to act as if you're sitting at this and questioning whether you are a mandatory reporter, to just err on the side of assuming that you are. You know, it won't be so relevant to tease that out if everybody's reporting and taking upon their responsibility, which I think most people want to do anyway. But you know, it's not necessarily, I say that to say it's not a cut and dry thing, and we're more urging people just to be good reporters for the sake of being good reporters.
In the past, there's been a lot of concern around when to report because there's concern around, well, maybe the incident happened 2 weeks ago, and now if I report, then someone will come down on me because I should have reported it sooner. But really, what we ask is report within 48 hours of suspecting. So if an incident occurs in the past, maybe it didn't raise red flags at the time, but maybe after having thought about it for a while, now it's raising some red flags. Just go ahead and report at that time. No one is going to be, it's more important that the report be made than it is people counting hours and being concerned about when the report is made relative to the incident. Because sometimes these things are nuanced, and it's much better that if there's suspicion, there's a report made than anybody be too concerned about, oh, the incident happened sometime in the past, and there's some idea that there's going to be some punitive damage because the time has gone by, if it's the case that there wasn't any suspicion at that time.
Mm-hmm. And you know, a little bit off the record, which is funny because I know this is being recorded, but you know, I think it's important to note that in institutional memory anyway, for everyone that's currently in APS, we haven't ever moved forward with any violations, fines, or any other recourse for people that were beyond this time period. So as Don mentioned, you know, the wording should really be emphasize it's when you suspect that maltreatment has occurred within 48 hours of that, not when the incident happened, and to move forward with that. And I also draw attention to the bottom of this. That's APS's approach to this. Your respective organizations may have their own policy around reporting and what you need to follow, and that you need to be aware of that for your own organization as well. We're just speaking from the state side, and from that's why you see that big disclaimer at the bottom of this, that this isn't legal advice, because we recognize that every various organization will have their own operating requirements.
The main point here is we don't want there to be a sort of a wet blanket thrown over a person that thinks they ought to report something because some time has passed. And there are several times, there's many cases where an incident can occur, someone thinks not particularly seriously, but maybe some other information comes to light that caused that incident to be viewed differently. So there's, as Joe mentioned, there hasn't been a case of someone being pursued because they made a report late. It's much better to have the report be better late than never, so to speak. So Adult Protective Services in the state of Vermont as the principal agency that is portion, I should say, of the state government responsible for investigating. So Adult Protective Services is the entity whom reports would be made to. And there's a couple of aspects to Adult Protective Service purpose. There's the investigation aspect, which is to figure out what's going on and whether some maltreatment occurred. There's an aspect of putting in protective services to help stop abuse, neglect, or exploitation that might be ongoing. And there's also an aspect that Adult Protective Services maintains a registry of individuals who are, have been substantiated against, which to sort of prohibit them from getting positions where they would be in a caregiving role formally, so as to protect individuals who need that care from folks who have been substantiated against in the past. The bulk of the staff are stationed around the state and do investigations in their geographic area, while the intake portion of Adult Protective Services is maintained centrally within Waterbury Complex.
And I would just emphasize here that you know, something that we tell reporters a lot as reports come in is making people aware that Adult Protective Services is not any kind of an emergency response mechanism. In addition to your mandatory reporter requirement to report to APS, if anything is time sensitive or an emergency situation, or you have any doubt around that at all, to call law enforcement, to call 911 and report there. Our investigations, we aim to close investigations in 60 to 90 days. So if there is a case of abuse or neglect or exploitation that's draining somebody's finances, often we can't act quickly enough to really put a stop to that, and that really is necessary for obvious reasons in these kinds of cases that we're looking at. So do report to 911 if it's you know, if it's at all time sensitive or escalated and needing some kind of emergency response.
Adult Protective Services maintains 4 primary reporting channels listed here. It notes that the preferred method is the website. The reason that method is preferred is because when a reporter completes a report online, when they submit that report and get that confirmation, they'll get the confirmation back, they'll get it back with the report number. That information is dumped directly into our system, and it's available immediately for follow-up by APS staff. So that's the reason the website web form is the preferred method, because it's immediately available. Sometimes when the phone calls come in, we are not able to answer the phone immediately, and then what can occur is a period of telephone tag. before we're able to take that information and get that information entered in. Similarly, with the email and the fax, then information has to be converted and has to be entered into our system before we can act on it. But when we get the web reports, that information is directly loaded immediately into our system. You get a confirmation of that. You get an option to print out the report that you submitted. And we have the information on our end within NPS to immediately act upon that report.
Mm-hmm. And John sort of said this, but just to emphasize, the web intake will walk you through the process of filing a complete report with us as well, which is another good reason to use the website, because if you call the 800 number and you leave a message and you forget to note you know, that you suspect that they're a vulnerable adult, that would be considered incomplete, and we need to have some kind of confirmation or at least suspicion on your part that they are vulnerable for us to have statutory authority to move forward. So the website is just another good way to ensure that a complete report is coming in versus just leaving details that, you know, aren't walking through that reporting process through those other channels.
As Joe mentioned, there's a number of aspects, number of pieces of information that we need to consider the report complete. This is not to say that if we don't receive all these information that we don't move forward with the report, but what it can mean is it can mean a delay in processing the report until we're able to reach out to reporters and other folks to get that information. So if the information is all provided up front and it's all provided in its entirety, then all the information that we need, then we can move the report forward faster than if there's chunks of the information that are missing. So if there's pieces missing that we require, then we have to see about acquiring those pieces of information, and that can take time. It can slow down the process. And this is just more of the aspects of the information that we're looking for.
So yeah, generally, really more details the better. Even if you don't suspect it's relevant, well, you'd have to suspect on some level it's relevant to tell us. But you know, if you're questioning that, do include it. There's sometimes ways that we can make linkages or identify other forms of maltreatment by as much information as you can give us, especially when it comes to other contacts that might be involved.
Yes, that's an important one. Other contacts, other individuals who might have information. That's definitely useful. Not only is it useful in the intake process, but it's also useful if investigation moves forward.
And your opinion does count too. I mean, if you feel that this just is improbable, you know, it's good for us to know that too, because it may steer us towards another form of maltreatment, which may be leading to the reason that this improbable thing is happening in the first place. So don't be afraid to let us know your take on it.
And the important point with who should file a report, obviously mandatory reporters have a responsibility to report or to see a report is made, but ideally there could be a situation when a large number of people have information about a particular incident, but ideally the person making the report, the person who's a reporter, is the person with the most direct information on that. Now, if there are other individuals who have other pieces of information, then that can be useful too. But it's certainly not helpful to if someone were to walk into a team meeting and there's 6 other individuals there and they tell about this incident, and then if all individuals feel like they need to report that what they just heard, that could mean we have 1 report from the person who understands the circumstance, and then 6 reports from people that just heard it secondhand, and that can really slow down how long it takes, or it can increase the time it takes for us to process that incident. So ideally, it's the person that has the most direct first-hand information. Although, having said that, if other individuals have other pieces of it, then we'd be happy to hear from them as well.
And this slide really has the most important message of this entire presentation. If you retain no other specific details about the forms of maltreatment or the operating timelines. None of that is as important as recognizing that, if you suspect or you are wondering if something should be reported, that you just go ahead and do that. If we create that awareness throughout the state, we would be thrilled with that being the main takeaway.
A couple of points. It can be difficult to know that a report is made if you're sort of relying on somebody else to make a report. Many organizations have the procedures in place that say that you report to your supervisor. And while if you see an incident and you report to your supervisor, while you may be meeting your organization's requirements, you might not be meeting Vermont's mandatory reporting requirements if that person were to not make a report, because in that case there wouldn't be a report made. The person couldn't be seen as causing a report to be made. Regarding the confidentiality of a report, it is possible that a report goes through the process, and if it goes through a certain portion of the appeal process, it could be possible for the information of the reporter, the identity of the reporter, be given to the other parties involved in the report. Under most circumstances, the identity of the reporter is kept confidential, but it's not. There are some circumstances where that could be revealed. And
I'll just add that APS does have safeguards against this. We, even though we can keep the reporter themselves updated, if somebody calls asking for information and they say they were the reporter, we ask for that in writing. We ask them to prove their identity. So we do go to great lengths to keep all of this confidential information under wraps, unless, as John said, in the small percentage, and only 3% go to the Human Services Board, and in that 3% there's an even much smaller percentage where we need to give this information, otherwise it is kept under wraps.
A flip side of this is that the status of the report, while it can be given to a reporter that makes the report, it's not to be given to anybody else that isn't identified as having a stake in a direct stake, primarily meaning the reporter. I think I misspoke on that a little bit. Let me just back up a little bit and say that, say if you're with an organization, one person within their organization makes that report. If somebody else within that organization calls and asks for a status on that report, we wouldn't be able to confirm or deny whether any report was in progress on that, because they weren't the reporter. So the reporter has rights, so to speak, to basic information status of the case, but nobody else does, and we can't really speak to any reports that we might or might not have in process to anybody but the reporter. If you don't report, when we were looking back at neglect, we mentioned that a failure to report could be considered neglect, a type of neglect. There are fines that could be levied in those cases as well. In the past, there's been a lot of fear around this, fear around the timing of it. I think the take-home message kind of goes back to when in doubt, report, and when you suspect, report. It doesn't need to be so tied to the incident and the time, but more tied to the incident or the suspicion.
And if there's a thematic shift going on here, I think, from the APS side more and more, we used to do a lot of training around mandatory reporting on this subject. What are the fines? When would those come into play? And we're really not even getting into that anymore, because we really want the thematic shift to be around protecting the AV and creating awareness and being mindful of reporting around that. As we've said, I think it's come up a couple of times. We've never actually fined anyone or taken action on this at least in the memory of the people that are working here now, and that's really not our culture. So we're really just trying to create awareness more than anything else that we exist and to encourage people to report.
One of the things that happens, it's important to know, when a report is made, there's notification, or I should say when a report is made, in most cases, the reporter is contacted for follow-up information. Now, that contact doesn't always occur. If a report is very comprehensive and very clear, then it might be that we working the intake don't need to follow up for more information. But we generally, most commonly, we do follow up for more information, make sure there's nothing else outstanding. But one thing that always occurs with every report that's received, the reporter is sent to the address that they give. So it's important that we have a mailing address for the reporter when they call in or when they submit the report, because the notification of the outcome of that report is sent to the reporter. And when we say the outcome of the report, some reports are screened in which case the reporter would receive a letter that states that the report has been assigned for investigation. Some reports are screened out, in which case the letter would speak to that. If the report is screened out, the letter would also give instructions in case the reporter had reason to believe that that was done inappropriately, or to say in error. And if they wish, they could have that decision reviewed. The instructions would be in that letter. So it's very important for reporters to give a valid mailing address when they make their reports, because that's the method that the notification goes out. When investigation occurs, there are investigations are initiated. There are a number of things that occur. Joe mentioned that it can take some time for an investigation to complete, and that's why we must emphasize that we're not emergency services. Once again, as the investigation progresses, there's very limited information that we can really provide on the content of the investigation. We can speak to a reporter about whether our investigation is ongoing. And then also at the time of the completion of the investigation, the reporters will be notified of that as well. Once again, while it's very important, or this is a reason why it's very important for us to have accurate contact information for the parties involved. On the screening decisions, as I mentioned previously, the notification of the screening decision goes out in writing and does include the information on how to request that they be reviewed. There's also a mechanism by which reporters can request substantiation recommendations be reviewed. That information would be also included in the notification.
And one just subset of how this all operates, there is a difference between reviews and appeals. Reviews are decisions whether or not to investigate, and as John said, if there was a feeling that there was an error made in making that decision, we can review that. Appeal is an appeal of our recommendation to substantiate or to not substantiate. That's a little bit more of an involved hearing. And just the way that our statute is set up, and one of the quirks of it is the AV cannot request that hearing. So it's something to keep in mind when you are reporting. You know, it's something to be mindful of, that as the reporter, you may continue to advocate for the AV, which I think is an important thing to be mindful of and to hopefully partake in if you feel that you know, there was some kind of wrong conclusion made at whatever stage, that you assist with that as well, and requesting that to be reviewed or requesting it to go to hearing.
Finally, we're here to answer your questions. Obviously, we're here to taking the reports and conducting investigations, but we really want this to be a partnership. We want to be able to answer your questions. We want to be able to work the reports cleanly and clearly and quickly as possible so as to provide the best service and provide the best protections for vulnerable adults throughout the states. So please do not hesitate if you have questions, to give us a call. One thing that we will say, though, is frequently we get calls requesting us to consider a hypothetical. By and large, if someone were to call us with a quote-unquote hypothetical situation, our feedback is primarily going to be, when in doubt, report. There's a real danger to considering too many hypotheticals, because then oftentimes the hypotheticals leave out various details of circumstance, and the circumstances are really case by case. So we kind of go back to, do you suspect abuse, neglect, or exploitation? Is there a reason to believe this is a vulnerable adult? When in doubt, report.
And then just the concluding thought here too, I think is worth drawing attention to that specifically, and that is, I know that as mandatory reporters, you probably had contact with APS in the past. You probably know investigators personally. It's a very instinctual, natural thing to do to go to them and say, oh, I wanted to let you know I saw this happen last week, just to be aware that that is not a report. You know, a few slides back we went through the 4 channels that constitute a report, and it needs to be one of those channels to officially be a report. If you give it to an investigator, in most cases, they may try to forward it or do something, but they're really not trained to take reports and to make assessments, and therefore we encourage you to really go through one of the established reporting channels to officially make a report.
And frequently the investigators just aren't in a position to receive that type and that volume of information. They're out there working on various cases of their own and doing these investigations. The intake staff and housed in the Waterbury complex are set up and prepared to take that information down, make sure it's taken down quickly and cleanly and accurately, and put into a report format so that it can then be acted upon.
And this concludes our mandatory reporter training. We'll go back a slide so you can see our contact information. As John said, we are here to answer your questions, and again, we'll emphasize it one more time. When in doubt, if something comes up that you suspect should be reported, definitely move forward with reporting it, and we appreciate you doing so.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.